Hi, good morning everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I want to thank everyone for coming to this event on Taiwan's recent election and sort of post-presidential readout. We decided, as we thought about this, to sort of take some time between the event itself and our assessment to allow folks to kind of get a better sense of what's happening. And I think we can all agree that just in the last 2 weeks, there have been some very interesting developments, as we were just discussing in the green room. Obviously, a fairly significant change in Taiwan politics, the perhaps surprisingly thorough victory of the DPP, previously the opposition party, soon to be the governing party, has got a lot of people talking on issues related to what this means demographically within Taiwan, what it means for the cross-strait relationship, obviously, and perhaps equally as important, if not more so, economics, and what that means for possible membership for Taiwan and TPP, their economic relations with the mainland, and obviously with the region. So fortunately, we're very blessed today to have three outstanding panelists to discuss this issue with us. Dr. Emerson Niou is Professor of Political Science at Duke University. He's the co-author of The Balance of Power, Stability in International Systems, and his current projects include studies of institutions and governance in China, security balance in the Taiwan Strait, and theories of alliance formation. And I've asked Dr. Niou to sort of walk through the demographic bits with us this morning and the polling to give us a sense of what's happening on the island of Taiwan itself. Bonnie Glaser, my colleague here at CSIS, is Senior Advisor for Asia and the Director of the China Power Project at CSIS, where she works on issues related to Chinese foreign and security policy and, of course, cross-strait policy and developments on Taiwan. She is concomitantly a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, a senior associate with the CSIS Pacific Forum, and a consultant for the U.S. government on East Asia. And prior to joining us here at CSIS, she served as a consultant for various U.S. government agencies, including the Department of Defense and State. And Bonnie will talk about the cross-strait security relationship and contending views over how that might look going forward. And then finally, Dr. Joshua Meltzer, our neighbor from a few blocks over at the Brookings Institution. He's Senior Fellow in Global Economy and Development at Brookings and an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Dr. Meltzer is also a reviewer for the Journal of Politics and Law, and his work focuses on international trade law and policy issues relating to the World Trade Organization and free trade agreements. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Niou to come up and kick us off. Thanks very much for coming.
Yeah, good morning. Very glad to have this opportunity to come to DC to share with you some of my research findings on Taiwan public opinion on national security issues with you. The findings are based on 9 surveys conducted from December 2002 to December 2015. 9 surveys funded by my own research grants, not by any private foundations. And all the data are public available. So if you visit that website, the Program in Asian Security website at Duke University, the survey questionnaires, data, they can be downloaded, and you're welcome to analyze the data and to use the data. I encourage people to use the data, and I have received several emails from political scientists in China complaining they couldn't download the data. It's not the Duke website's problem. It's China didn't allow people to access Dropbox. So we are trying to find a better cloud program to store the data. Otherwise, they couldn't download the data. So the findings are based on these 9 surveys. So I'm going to go over them. These are all telephone surveys. So questions have to be very colloquial and easy to follow so people won't hang up the phone. And the questionnaires are designed in order to help us understand these 4 factors, how they impact the stability in the Taiwan Strait. And these are from the 1949 even, China's military threat to Taiwan, and starting in 1950, the American security commitment, not commitment, to more or less to Taiwan to help defend Taiwan. Then starting in the 80s, the trade between the two sides started to play a more and more important role. And then again, in the 80s, Taiwan's democratization also started to play a very important role. Taiwan's domestic politics began to play a very important role, affecting the stability in the Taiwan Strait. So these surveys are designed to understand the effects of these four factors and the interactions among these four factors. Right? So to start up, some easy questions, asking respondents, hey, how many times have you visited China? Have you been to China? And as of 2015, half of the respondents have been to China. All right? A quarter of them been there many times, several times. And 15% have business or have employment in China. If Taiwan has a little bit more than 8 million households, so that's about 1.2 million households have people. So we heard this estimate, there might be more than 1 million Taiwanese businessmen have employment in China. That's pretty reliable if we use this as a way to infer the number of businessmen. And so how many visitors from China to Taiwan, from Taiwan to China? And you can see that from 2009 to 2014, just in 5 years, the number of visitors from China to Taiwan increased from 1 million to 4 million. Right? And Taiwan, as of 2014, 2015, has over 3 million. So every year now, 7 million trips being made between people from the two sides. So interactions, very close interactions. And trade, right? We heard a lot about trade and Taiwan's export to China and imports from China, 200 billion. And you can see from this graph, most of the trade between the two sides are exports from Taiwan to China. But I started to Google around and say, 200 billion, that's such a big number. It doesn't mean anything to me. So I started I'm pretty sure the trade between USA and Japan in 2014 is 200 billion. So think about the world's largest economy and the third largest economy. Their total trade in goods is 200 billion, and the trade between Taiwan and China is 200 billion. So you can see how the intensity. Right? And so I learned something about 200 billion, the meaning of 200 billion. Before then, I didn't really quite understand. Okay, it's a big number, but now I have a better understanding. And okay, so we know a lot of trade is going on, but do you want to strengthen even more the trade relation with China? 62% say, yeah, we need to have more trade in order to keep Taiwan's, for whatever reason, we didn't give them a reason. So do you want more trade with China? Yes, 62%. All right. But do you worry about China using the trade advantage for political gains down the road? Yes, they also worry. So they want more trade, but they are quite aware that trade dependence, economic dependence might be used by China for political purpose. Right? And if we do a cross-stat, trying to also look at how they correlate with voters' vote choice in the 2016. But the survey was conducted in December 2015, so we only asked respondents their vote, which candidate they inclined to vote for. All right, so we didn't really have their vote choice, but we have their vote. We have this inclination of their vote. And you can see that the top two rows, yes, a majority of the respondents worry about being coerced. But you can see also the lower two rows, a majority of them would like to have more trade. The middle row shows you those yes, we worry about being coerced, but we still want more trade. That's 30% of the voters. And who supported Tsai Ing-wen? Mostly from the top two rows, all right? I mean, the reason I drew a line is read the percentage from top to bottom. So Tsai's support, 67 of her support from those who didn't want to have more trade because they worry about being coerced. All right, 67 of her supporters are in that category. The other 30-some% are from the other two. And Eric Chu's supporter clearly came from totally different segment. That's taken from the New York Times, yeah. And so those on the wall are those are 61%. Yeah, this is also a big issue in Taiwan now. Are you Taiwanese, Chinese, or both? All right. Clearly, very few people consider themselves Chinese only. Right? But you can see the shift from the last, just happened very quickly in the last 12 years. Right? In 2002, still close to 60% of the people consider themselves both Chinese and Taiwanese, and have decreased to less than 40%. And then those who consider themselves Taiwanese only increased from 36% probably to close to 60%. So they switch in the last 10, 12 years. And this thing is, this divergence is not going to slow down. It's not going to be reversed, in my opinion. And so again, because I only have a few minutes left, so you can download the PDF file. You can see the identification and vote choice also closely correlated. So Tsai supporters, majority of them consider themselves Taiwanese only. Right? That's not a surprising finding. And also, I have these 3 questions asking respondents. How much do they like Japan, the USA, and China? So based on the scores they provided, I can rank order their preferences. Do they like American, the United States the most, then China, then Japan? I can start to rank order them. And let's just look at this table. You can see that I was quite surprised. More than 50% of the Taiwanese or respondents like Japan the most. Taiwan used to be a colony of Japan, so they probably missed something. And about 70% ranked China either the last or share the last place in other country. 55% or 56% ranked China the last. Just think, 7 million people, visited each other every year, and 200 billion. Now you know what 200 billion mean now, and traded every year. But Taiwanese really don't have high regards of Chinese or China. Right? Rank at the bottom, clearly. But for Americans, don't give up hope. In 2012, the USA was ranked higher than Japan. Right. Something changed in the last 3 years. So Taiwanese respondents somehow really like Japan. And we know that most of the Taiwanese like to maintain the status quo. So let's see what kind of conditions we can provide in order to help them move away from the status quo to support independence, to support unification. And here, for the independence, I say, if declaring independence, China will not attack you, would cause China to attack you. Yeah, will attack you. Do you want independence? Then clearly, 65% say, I don't want independence if I will be attacked by China. But we say, if China will not attack you, do you want independence? Then 77% say, in that case, I would like to have independence. So China's military deterrence is working. Clearly it's working. Okay? So Taiwanese preferences on independence, in this case, shows you it is conditioned by China's military threat. And from 2000, well, I say 2003, that's 2002. 2002 to 2015, you can see, yes, there's there's some changes. So more people are what we call unconditionally supporting independence. It's not a big increase, but there's a slow, a small increase of respondents who will consider independence regardless of whether Taiwan will be attacked by China or not. And how about, again, if you do a cross-strait between preferences, then you can see that Thai supporters, 56% of Thai supporters will support independence regardless of whether Taiwan will be attacked by China. Right? And very different from the other candidate supporters. And unification, same thing. We say, hey, if China also someday became more democratic, become more economically developed, and all, would you consider unification with China? Well, no. The first one is if the two sides are very different, would you consider unification? No. 83% say no. But if China became more democratic and all that, would you consider unification? Still very low. 29% say yes. Right? So the two sides are drifting apart. And you can see the changes so clearly here. In 2002, 37% of the people would not consider unification as an option. In 2015, more than 70% of the people would not consider unification, regardless of how democratic China became. They would not consider unification with China anymore. I don't think this is reversible either. But preferences is one thing. And we also have a question on the survey questionnaire asking, down the road, do you think unification is more likely to be the outcome or Taiwan independence? Surprisingly, this is not the first year. We have done this from 2012. Yes, most people would prefer Taiwan independence if China would not attack Taiwan, but their expectation whether Taiwan can become united or become unified with China, still a majority of them think that the two sides will become united. So expectation and preferences here do not coincide. So that's a very good research topic. And so welcome to download the data and analyze that. And so preference and expectation are quite different. I wish there's a screen here so I can. Okay, just very quick. Sorry, Chris.
No problem.
Just show you some information about the Taiwanese perception of the security environment they are in, and we asked them, in your opinion, are Taiwan and China in a friendly or hostile relations now? And not much change. Right? So most people consider the two sides relatively friendly. Right? Then only 15% of the respondents will score 4 or lower. Right? Assuming if it's below 5, that means they're less friendly, more hostile. Right? And if we ask them, if Taiwan won the presidential election, would you worry that it will heighten the tension between Taiwan and mainland China? And Thais ran a beautiful campaign. More than 70% of the respondents didn't worry about the outcome. Would not think Thai's victory will heighten the tension between the two sides. So in that sense, Thai really ran a good campaign. And would China attack Taiwan if Taiwan declared independence? And Thai supporters, 53% say no, China would not attack. And 57% say yes. And Chu supporter, 77% say if we declare independence, China will attack. So their perceptions are very different. Thai supporters and Jew supporters. Thai supporters are less worried about China's threat. Right? And would the U.S. come to help defend us? And Thai supporter, 81% have confidence that the USA will come to help defend us. And the Jew supporter say, no. All right. And so clearly their perception of the China's threat and the confidence in the United States commitment, security commitment are very different. From 2002 to 2015, we can see the trend. After Ma Ying-jeou became the president, Taiwanese have growing more confidence in the U.S. security commitment and became less worried about China's military threat, which these two will sync with each other. The more you have confidence in the U.S. commitment, of course, you become less worried about China's threat. But 2015, suddenly, the Taiwanese respondents have worried more about China's threat and have less confidence. So maybe because they look ahead and see Tsai Ing-wen might win, maybe that have some effect on their perceptions. And do you have confidence in the ROC's military? Do you think our military is capable of defending Taiwan? 90% say no. All right, don't count on the military. All right. And if a war breaks out between Taiwan and China, do you think most of the Taiwanese, people from DC often like to know how resilient Taiwanese are, and pretty good, 60%, or they think 60% of the Taiwanese, not how likely do you think most of the people, yes, 60% of the respondents think that most of the Taiwanese will rise up to help defend themselves. And so the national title, some people believe that Taiwan is already an independent country. Its name is the Republic of China, and there's no need to seek further independence. Do you agree or disagree with this view? 75%. This is a very constant. All right. A few of the questions, the results, this is very constant from 2002 to 2015, around 75%, and it didn't change much. Even Thai supporters, 2/3 of Thai supporters can take that position. So Tsai Ing-wen going to attend the National Day ceremony, the Double 10 Day, I mean, not a wrong decision. 2/3 of her supporters. And the controversial 92 consensus, the one China with own interpretation, and do you support this position? 2/3 support this position, all right, at least in December 2015. And so again, that correlates with very much with the vote choice. So Tsai supporters, 45% cannot accept the 92 consensus, and 55% can accept. But the other message here, the number doesn't show, is those who disagree cannot accept the 92 consensus. Almost more than 90% of them supported Tsai. All right? 90% of those who do not accept the 92 consensus supported Tsai. Right? And so this is my last slide. When we ask respondents whether they will support independence based on whether their perception, if China will attack you, if China will not attack you, and 40% of them we label them as the conditional Taiwan independence supporters. That is, they will only support independence only if China would not attack them. Right? So the 40% conditional Taiwan independence supporters, and their preferences, the reason we call them the conditional Taiwan independence is those conditions are decided by China, decided by the USA. So Taiwanese public opinion on independence can be influenced by the Chinese policy, can be influenced by the US security commitment to Taiwan. Preferences are not fixed. Preferences, some of the people's preferences can be changed. So I just reported a lot of survey findings. They are observations. So I don't have answers to most of them. But I'm just sharing with you, and Bonnie and Chris will provide more answers about some of the questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Bonnie?
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chris. And I can't tell you what the 23 million people of Taiwan think, just what this humble scholar thinks about the cross-strait situation in the aftermath of the elections in Taiwan. I think it's clear if we look at the set of issues that Tsai Ing-wen talked about during the campaign, that she really is focused on the domestic situation. She wants to reinvigorate the economy in Taiwan, to narrow the widening gap in incomes between people who are relatively rich and poor, concerned about employment, particularly for young people, making Taiwan more competitive internationally, helping the small and medium enterprises. So she has quite a deep set of domestic issues that really relate, I think, mostly to the economy. But of course, these intersect with the international situation. Like Ma Ying-jeou, Tsai Ing-wen wants Taiwan to prepare itself to be considered to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership and increase Taiwan's participation in various international organizations. So it should be quite clear, I think, to everybody, and I think Tsai Ing-wen herself is acutely aware of the fact that this agenda requires a good relationship with mainland China. Clearly, if there are tensions with the mainland, so many of these goals that she wants to achieve will really be unattainable. So I think it's quite clear that when she has said that she wants to maintain the status quo, that this is really genuine. It is essential for her agenda. Now, if we look at this from Beijing's perspective, I think that Xi Jinping has a pretty big plate at home. The anti-corruption campaign, reforming the PLA, and of course the slowing Chinese economy are just among the issues that are really urgent for him to manage. Cross-strait stability is very much in mainland China's interests. Now, of course, if Tsai Ing-wen were to engage in what the mainland sees as provocative actions, I don't think that Xi Jinping would hesitate to take a tougher stance. And we have seen Xi Jinping's willingness to endure friction with a very large number of neighbors. So I don't rule that out, but I think clearly the preference of mainland China is to see an enduring cross-strait relationship. Now, of course, from the U.S. point of view, this goes without saying that increased cross-strait tensions would complicate the U.S.-China relationship in a number of ways. And a great deal of the friction that the U.S. and China have today takes place in the Asia-Pacific region. This would really compound the problems that we have with China, might undermine bilateral cooperation on other issues. For a whole range of reasons, it's quite clear the U.S. would like to see the cross-strait relationship remain stable. So then we have to ask the question, what is the basis for the preservation of this stability? And that's where we see these differences between particularly the mainland and Tsai Ing-wen. So Beijing insists that the political foundation of the cross-strait relationship is the 1992 consensus and opposition to Taiwan independence. And so far, Tsai Ing-wen has not been willing to accept either of those. She has not rejected the 1992 consensus, but she has also not embraced it. It was very interesting in this interview that many of you may have read in the Liberty Times about a week ago. Tsai Ing-wen talked about her stance on cross-strait relations. And she repeated some of the things she said here at CSIS in her speech last June, but she added some very interesting things as well. And one of the things she said was that she understands and respects the historical fact that Taiwan and the mainland had talks in 1992, and that at that time that they agreed to set aside their differences and seek common ground. She once again referred to, which again she said at CSIS, that the more than 20 years of exchanges and negotiations should be cherished and protected. And she defined this existing political foundation, a phrase that I think the mainland very much would like to hear, even though they have a different definition, as including all these historical facts, as well as the prevailing Republic of China constitutional order, Taiwan's democratic principles, and the will of the Taiwanese people. So I think this is an effort to try and present a possible new formulation that in which both sides would have their own interpretation of what the political foundation of the relationship is, and there would be some ambiguity, just as there has been ambiguity, of course, in the interpretation of the 1992 consensus. I see this as a sincere gesture. It is, I believe, an effort to provide the mainland with some reassurances. It remains to be seen whether this is going to be enough for Beijing. But the reaction so far from Beijing to this and overall to her election has been fairly calm. You could compare this with prior years when we have seen some hysteria from the mainland. This has been a very calm response. There was just last week the annual Taiwan Work Conference. It's held Taiwan Affairs Work Conference on the mainland, where the representatives of all of their Taiwan Affairs offices from around the nation get together. And there's been some interesting reports that we've seen from the Chinese media, really quite similar to what was said last year. The need to reach out to Taiwan more, have more cultural ties, people-to-people exchanges, and a little bit of a question mark as to whether or not the communication channels between the two sides of the strait will remain open. So that language is not included this year, and that's also worth paying attention to. But no hysteria. So, three scenarios that I would lay out as possibilities going forward. The best case scenario is fairly obvious. This new formulation, or some other new formulation, could be agreed upon between the two sides. And I think the hope would be that that would keep the cross-strait channels open. CEF and ARATS, Mainland Affairs Council, Taiwan Affairs Office, and all of the pragmatic cooperation channels that have been created on both sides of the strait. I think that this would include continuing progress in the economic relationship, where the oversight bill in the legislative yuan, it appears is going to be one of Tsai Ing-wen's priorities in her first 100 days in office, and then perhaps the trade and services agreement and merchandise agreement going forward and being implemented. So I think this would be the best outcome for the US and for Beijing and for Taipei. Beijing obviously insists on its definition of the status quo, but whether or not they will be flexible remains to be seen. So a second scenario is that the Chinese sort of, hunker down, dig in, and say, it's my definition or nothing, and then there could be pressure that Beijing puts on Tsai Ing-wen. We've seen a little bit of that pressure so far, not too much. There have been some highlights in Beijing's media of military exercises opposite Taiwan, although I think some of those exercises actually didn't take place in the aftermath of the elections. They just made it look that way. But there were some exercises. There have been suggestions that tourists from the mainland to Beijing to Taiwan are going to be cut. These are fairly minor compared to, of course, what the Chinese could do, because they have a pretty large diplomatic toolbox, an economic toolbox, and military, of course, if they want to really try and pressure Taiwan. So we could see, for example, stealing away Taiwan's diplomatic allies, and we have seen reports about that possibility in the media. There are many of Taiwan's diplomatic allies that actually would like to switch their allegiance to Beijing, and because of the tacit diplomatic truce, Beijing has actually held them off. There could be pressure on other countries to not negotiate free trade type agreements with Taiwan. That pressure has already existed for ever since Taiwan signed the agreements with Singapore and with New Zealand. I think in the aftermath of the problems with the sunflower movement and the freezing of this of the Taiwan of the trade and services agreement, there has been an unwillingness by the mainland to allow other countries to continue to talk to Taiwan about these agreements, and that's been very, very unfortunate. So these kinds of actions could precipitate a negative reaction from Tsai Ing-wen. So my worry is that if this scenario emerges, that then under domestic political pressure, Tsai might be compelled to explicitly defend Taiwan's sovereignty, maybe even openly reject the 1992 consensus and one China, which she has been careful not to do. And in this scenario, the U.S. is likely, I think, to take measures to try and help and protect Taiwan and to criticize mainland China. And there probably would be negative ramifications for the U.S.-China relationship. The third scenario is, of course, I think, the least likely. It is one in which the mainland adopts a wait-and-see attitude, but Tsai Ing-wen initiates provocative actions, and then the mainland reacts harshly. We've seen this movie before, obviously, when Chen Shui-bian was president. And my view is that the United States would react very similar as it did in the past. I know there are some people on the mainland who think that the United States really wants Taiwan to pursue some pro-independence agenda so we can use Taiwan as a card against mainland China to contain it. This is a narrative that doesn't ring true to me at all. I don't think that this would really serve U.S. interests. Some thoughts that I was going to say about South China Sea, but I think I'll save that until the discussion. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Bonnie. Dr. Meltzer.
Thanks. I just want to say thanks to CSIS for the invitation to be here. It's great to have an opportunity to talk about this very important topic. A lot of what I'm going to say mirrors, I think, what Bonnie said in terms of the significance of the election of Tsai Ing-wen. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the trade and economic side and think through what some of the implications might be from the election of the DPP. I think when we think about, what it means, clearly the question is, what does it mean for Taiwan economically? We need to really understand why it was that the DP won the election. And essentially, I agree with Bonnie that at least the understanding that we have at the moment is that this should certainly not be seen as an anti-China vote. If you look at Tsai's sort of victory speech, her mentioning of China and Cross-strait's relationship was the last thing she talked about, where she sort of emphasised stability and maintaining the status quo. In many respects, I think, the DPP win is a lot more sort of prosaic, and I think in this sense sort of reflects a deepening, I think, of Taiwan's democracy when issues such as jobs, education, cost of living, income distribution were really, the key focus for the electorate. And so I think what this means then is, how the Tsai administration succeeds or doesn't over the next few years is really going to be judged against these standards upon which the election was essentially won. And to achieve a lot of these key goals here is essentially going to require more stronger, deeper and broader levels of economic growth in Taiwan. And to achieve this, and this is, I think, the similar thesis to what Bonnie was saying, is that part of a key element of achieving this is going to be good cross-straits relations. So in a sense here, one point I think I want to make is that the deepening, I think, of Taiwan's democracy is probably actually a force for stability and moderation in cross-strait relations, even with a DPP government. But the other point, of course, which stems from the importance of cross-strait relations, is that Taiwan is really going to have to address its international economic challenges as well if it's going to generate sustainable economic growth going forwards. And so if we think about the Taiwan economy, broadly speaking, it's very open, integrated into supply chains. Taiwan businesses make a lot of intermediate goods, computer chips, motherboards, and the like. It relies heavily on trade and investment. About 3/4 of Chinese GDP comes from international trade. And so its capacity to compete globally, its capacity to attract FDI, foreign direct investment, are going to be sort of crucial components that determine how the Taiwan economy fares going forward. And this is going to be a component of, this is going to require both good cross-strait relations and really growing and improving economic dimension of that, as well as improving the capacity of Taiwan to integrate more globally into the global economy. I want to just talk briefly a little bit more about the cross-strait relations, and then I'll look at the international economic system a little bit more broadly and what this means for Taiwan. So the relationship with China is obviously going to be key here when we think about its range of international economic relationships. About 40% of Taiwan's exports go to China, and you compare this to a total of about 17% of Taiwan's exports going to the US and Japan combined. There's very high levels of FDI, unofficial estimates around $200 billion. But China's also not the economy it was even 2-3 years ago. It's a slowing economy. Exports are down almost 17% from a year last year, and this is going to present a whole series of challenges for Taiwan going forward. Part of it is a reflection of the slowing down of the Chinese economy more broadly. Part of it is that China is developing its own domestic industry on parts of the supply chain where Taiwan has normally been competitive. We also know that there's an effort to move the Taiwanese economy more into services. And so while China will remain an important manufacturing base and a processing base for exports globally, the opportunities really for Taiwanese businesses are going to increasingly be in the services sector, which is where Taiwanese businesses potentially have some real advantages. There's language, there's a lot of local knowledge, but it's also an area where Taiwan struggles. They don't have a lot of sort of brand names and do not themselves have a robust services economy, which can provide a good base for actually taking advantage of these opportunities. So it's one where there are going to be new challenges for Taiwan going forward. If you think about the China's approach to Taiwan, certainly during the previous administration, during the Ma administration, there was a lot of economic carrots, certainly in the form of the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, essentially the trade agreement that they did with Taiwan. And if you look at the services protocol or the services agreement, which sort of never got through the legislative review, and it was one where China offered a lot of essentially market access opportunities to Taiwan sort of going forward, which more than sort of, it was an imbalance in a sense in terms of like the benefits that China was prepared to offer on that front. Now, it may in fact be the case that under Tsai that there's actually more opportunities to move this agenda, in part because there's now control of the legislature, which means that her agenda might have some more chances of success. And we might actually see more trust in her administration in managing economic relations with China, given that there's the less of the explicit sort of political closeness that the KMT has had. So we might actually see some progress here going forward, but this is still to be seen. On the broader international economic space, we all know that there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, 12 countries, United States and 11 others, 40% of global GDP, 25% of exports, formally signed last week. Taiwan obviously not a party to this. Approximately 30% of Taiwan's exports go to TPP countries, and Taiwan has essentially made it understood that it's looking at this agreement very closely and is interested in joining this agreement. The TPP, of course, is going to potentially expand. Korea, Philippines, Indonesia are some countries, to mention a few, that have indicated interest in joining. So the importance of the TPP to Taiwan is only going to expand. Now, accession to the TPP is going to require the consent of all parties. And this goes back to Bonnie's observation about the role that China has been playing and will continue to play in working, in making its concerns known to other countries about whether or not Taiwan should or shouldn't be joining these other agreements. The fact that the TPP is also being so explicitly, I think, cast as part of the United States rebalancing towards Asia, I think makes China's approach to Taiwan joining the TPP more complex than a normal trade agreement would be for China. And it's not the only large trade agreement going on, obviously, that Taiwan is not participating in. There's a regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is the ASEAN +6, China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. There are other FTAs of significance. There's the trade and services negotiations. And of course, underlying all of this is the fact that the WTO Doha round is finished, so there's no multilateral negotiation which is providing any opportunities for Taiwan. So very quickly, most favoured nation is becoming least favoured nation for Taiwan. So here, in a sense, is a dilemma, I think, which is that Taiwan really needs to join free trade agreements, and in particular, it needs to join the large trade arrangements such as the TPP if it's going to sort of improve the competitiveness of its businesses, provide new opportunities for its economy to grow. Failure to do this is probably going to lead to only increased economic dependence on China and probably heighten Taiwanese concern about this development, which may feed into other political trends which would not be necessarily something you would think Beijing would want to see, such as heightened senses of identity and making the development of the political realm even more challenging. So it's a situation, I think, where Beijing is probably going to have to think through what it would see possibly as the least sort of worst sort of option. And my view on this is that a sort of robust, confident Taiwan is one that is going to be ultimately better placed and a better partner for China going forward. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dr. Meltzer. Before we turn it over to the audience for some questions, I wanted to go ahead and ask each of the panelists a follow-up question myself. I'll just go right down the order, and then you can answer them. Dr. Niou, you talked a lot about this very compelling shift in attitudes. Last time you were here visiting us, you talked about it. It looks like those trends have only strengthened. One of the questions I have for you is, from your perspective, how aware is the mainland of these trends that you document with regard to changing attitudes on Taiwan, especially with regard to how they think about unification and so on? Do you have a sense of their ability to track that, and can they admit, if you will, within their own system, that this is indeed happening, and do you have a sense at all of what they might try to do about it?
I don't have any contact with anyone in China on this, but I do have colleagues in Taiwan who have been invited by some agencies in China to brief them periodically on these things, and we are doing the surveys together. So I don't know how much have been conveyed to them, but I'm pretty sure they are doing a good job. So I don't know.
Yeah.
That's all I know. I know some exchange of ideas been going on, have been going on for many years. So.
Good, thanks. Bonnie, you talked a lot about sort of the Chinese side, at least for now, turning to the playbook that we've seen before, kind of a wait-and-see policy. I was really struck by what you said about the possibility of the diplomatic competition possibly tipping that over and becoming a concern. Certainly, my recollection is when President Chen was in, was relatively moderate when he first came in, and it was only when that process started to take place that he really got jazzed up about that. So how do you see that sort of playing out? And then secondly, I think you make a very compelling point. Obviously, Madam Tsai's a smart person. She's not going to do anything stupid, with regard to pushing the envelope on independence and so on. In your assessment, what are the more understated possibilities for actions she might take that would upset the mainland? In other words, what should we be looking for in terms of unexpected things that she might do that could provoke a stronger reaction from the mainland?
Interesting questions. So on the former question, I think that the mainland is very aware of the sensitivity of the issue with the diplomatic allies. And this is not just with the government of Taiwan, but with the people. Again, the polls, although Emerson didn't include this issue in his polls, there are other surveys that demonstrate that the people of Taiwan attach a great deal of importance to having diplomatic allies and having participation in the international community. So I'm worried about it, but for the mainland, this is something that in a sense, as I said, sort of has deniability, where they can say, well, every country ought to be able to have diplomatic relations with whomever they want. And yes, that is true to a certain extent. But in this case, clearly it would be viewed by Taiwan as the mainland altering a practice that they have stuck to for the entire Ma Ying-jeou administration. So I think it's something everybody is aware of, very sensitive of, and it's something that the mainland they could take one, they could take 5. I really think that it would immediately trigger a very negative reaction from Taiwan that could precipitate this sort of negative spiral. And your second question was
basically, what might be unexpected? We
know
the
what unexpected.
Would, tip the mainland immediately, but what's the underlying stuff that perhaps no one's looking for, and
well,
that could be challenging?
Look, nobody expects that Tsai Ing-wen is going to, declare independence. Again, question on, declaring de jure independence. I just don't think, besides the fact that there's always been this big question of what would the rest of the world do with really recognize it? I'm sure the mainland would take it very seriously. I don't think the rest of the world would necessarily say, well, now something is fundamentally shifted. But obviously this is quite sensitive, just not going to happen. There are other things that I think the mainland is really worried about. In my conversations with the mainland, there is emphasis on Taiwan's interest in reaching out to Japan and strengthening that relationship with Japan, particularly in security terms. And I think they, in their worst case, there's contingency planning and even a sort of Taiwan Relations Act, which has been considered by Prime Minister Abe's brother in the Diet. Again, I think they see an acorn, and there's an acorn, they see an oak tree. I don't expect that, but they're really quite worried. And then the other issue would be the South China Sea. And that is an area where I think there will be some continuity with the Ma Ying-jeou administration, but there will also be some potential changes. So in the area of continuity, I think that there will be no change in maintaining the claim to sovereignty over all of the land features, the position of adhering to international law and the Convention of the Law of the Sea, wanting Taiwan to play a peaceful role, contribute to regional stability in some ways. Avoiding cooperation directly with China, absolutely, and that's been Ma Ying-jeou as well, and seeking inclusion in maybe Track 2 discussions and, of course, trying to enter into Track 1 discussions. So I think there'll be continuity on all of those. I think there might be differences in 2 areas. One would be whether or not the DPP will further open up the archives to the public. And I think this is really a question of timing. I see the DPP as attaching a lot of importance to transparency and believing that this is something that they should make public. But timing is important, not going to be the first thing that she's going to do in her administration. And then the second, which I think is really particularly sensitive, is how the Tsai Ing-wen administration will react to the ruling that the Philippines case is brought to the UNCLOS tribunal. And here I would say that I think there's recognition that Tsai Ing-wen and the people around her have that this is a very sensitive issue with the mainland. And so they do not want this to be something that would cause a major setback in the relationship. So they're really quite sensitive to that. But at the same time, I think they really do value Taiwan being a responsible international citizen. So I think they are going to handle this very, very cautiously. And I'll add just one more sentence on domestic issues of what she could do that could really irritate the mainland. They are obsessed with the process of de-sinification that really started under Chen Shui-bian. And this has to do with revising history textbooks and things like that. And they are already warning that she should not take any steps in that area either.
Two quick follow-ups. You had mentioned, I don't think it came out in your formal remarks before we started the panel, your concerns about the absence of the issue of maintaining communication in the Taiwan Work Conference. And then secondly, something you've written a lot and spent a lot of time thinking about, further definition of the 9-dash line by the Taiwan side. How do you think that changes at all under Tsai administration? Taiwan's willingness to do something there?
Well, the definition of what was originally their 11-dash line is related to this issue of opening the archives. Right. So it's a question of making transparent what was the original intention behind the creation of that line. Was there any assertion to sovereignty over waters, or was it just the land features inside that 11-dash line? So I think that their inclination is to make this public, make it clear what the intentions were, and to bring the claim in line fully with UNCLOS. But as I said, I think timing is just really critical on that. And the ruling may come down, some people say as early as April, and other people say it may be May or June. Could come down during Ma Ying-jeou's term, right? And it could come down potentially, it could be issued after Tsai Ing-wen is inaugurated on May 20th. I think it would be really unfortunate if it is the first thing that she has to confront as president. But again, I think she's going to handle it very, very carefully. On the maintenance of communication channels, ultimately, I think that's one of the most important things from the perspective of the United States and people who are very concerned about the preservation of cross-strait stability. That I have certainly heard privately from officials, not just scholars on the mainland, that of course if there's no embracing of the 1992 consensus, how can we continue to have contacts between CEF and ARATs? I think there's already been some articles in the Taiwan press about how there's been an attempt to use the hotline that was only recently created. No answer at the other end. In the Taiwan Affairs Office, it said something about, well, we're only going to use this for really pressing issues. I don't know who defines pressing, but again, these are all signals. I've heard people say, we're not going to interfere with tourists going to Taiwan. But of course, mainland citizens would just not want to go. So, they're not trying not to be too explicit about these threats, but definitely there is, people in the mainland are thinking through these set of issues. And I hope that these communication channels do remain open.
Great, thanks. Joshua, you make a very compelling case in your presentation about the need for Taiwan to participate in these agreements that are being shaped around them. You definitely get the sense when you visit Taiwan these days of their appreciation of the fact that the not only economic but also strategic geopolitical tectonic plate shifting that's going on around them, and you get the sense of a concern about being the child with their face pressed up against the glass, watching this all happen around them. One of the issues I think, though, that Taiwan has faced in this regard, especially when it comes to possible TPP membership, is the fact that in many ways their domestic economy remains very protectionist, and there's a lot of issues there. And some have speculated that one of the challenges with that is a lot of the sort of interest group, the vested interests on Taiwan, who were opposing opening that more, had close ties to the KMT political machine and so on. Do you think Madam Tsai would be in a better position to perhaps pursue greater openness, given that she's not affiliated with those groups? And how do you think about that in terms of Taiwan making itself more attractive to an invitation to TPP?
Yeah, so very, very good question, because it's important, I think, when we think about a potential pathway to the TPP to recognise that in many respects there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the Taiwanese side before it essentially would become a credible candidate, certainly here in the US and before Congress. And, we only need to go back and look at what seem to be fairly small issues such as pork and ractopamine and beef and the rest of it, to realise though how politically significant they became, and what stumbling blocks, and how much political capital actually even President Ma spent trying to resolve some fairly insignificant issues, which I think has created a sense here that there wasn't, at least under that administration, the capacity to undertake the type of reforms that would be required for TPP membership. Now, my sense is that because, for two reasons. One, because of the sensitivity of Taiwan joining TPP and the sort of diplomatic and political hurdles that would need to be overcome on that front, that the focus initially is going to be on domestic economic reform. A lot of what Taiwan needs to do is within its own hands, in a sense, and there's a lot that could be done domestically, and I think that the emphasis that Tsai's placed on sort of working constructively, both with obviously the LY, but also the KMT, in trying to push forward sort of a reform agenda, signals that approach. And then, that will take some time, and we will hopefully see passage of TPP, and we'll learn more about what an accession process to TPP might look like. And I think at that point, when China may be in a different position in terms of where it's on the TPP, and the gods may align a little bit differently at that point to think about Taiwan's membership.
Great, thanks. Okay, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. Per standard CSIS protocol, we've got mics around the room, so please wait for that to arrive. Do let us know who you are and where you're from, and do confine yourself to a question rather than a commentary. So we'll go ahead and take questions. We'll start with the young lady here in the front. Just wait for the mic.
Thanks for coming today. My name is Ivy. I'm a recent graduate from University of Southern California. So my question is, seeing the world today, the reality is the U.S. needs China's help with more urgent global challenges like North Korea, Russia, or even ISIS. So how will this increase of cooperation will affect the U.S. role in China-Taiwan disagreements, like, for example, joining TPP? Yes, thanks.
It's a good question, and a very difficult one to answer. It's not clear to me the extent these issues get necessarily sort of traded off to some extent. I'm not sure if that was implicit in your question. I mean, I think in some respects, a lot of these global issues are increasingly shared global issues, not necessarily, specifically United States global concerns, and it can often get dealt with in that sense. So. Whether there's a grand bargain out there, I'm not sure, but it's not clear to me that addressing these discrete issues that you're talking about is going to sort of bleed into these other considerations down the track.
I would just add briefly to that first of all, if you look at what seemed to be a fairly contentious meeting that Secretary Kerry had with his counterpart in Taiwan over the North Korea issue, not exactly clear how willing China is to participate. I think the other issue that's quite sensitive for the U.S. administration, and something the administration is doing quite well, there's a perception that during the Chen Shui-bian period, the Chinese were perhaps too successful in getting in the U.S. decision cycle on how we were managing our relationship with Taiwan. I think the administration is sensitive to that, and I think we've seen all along this process a desire to tell the mainland that's not going to happen, and I would think that would continue to be the case. Next, yeah, right up here in front. Just wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. Excuse me for not standing for the sake of the cameras in the back. John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Bonnie, you talked about the three scenarios in cross-strait relations, and you seem to say that the third scenario is probably the most unlikely. But the first two, particularly the first one, you talked about Tsai Ing-wen talking about 92 talks and the spirit of seeking common ground while preserving differences. 92 is a good beginning for the Chinese because they like 92 consensus. But the key to them, as I asked Joseph Wu here at the same place, the key to them is not 92. The key to them is some kind of a one China. However weak that might be, but they needed something there so that they can justify their continued exchange with Taiwan. How likely or unlikely do you see that the two sides can compromise or come up with something that has the weakest one China link in there? Thank you. Mr. Johnson, you are welcome to comment on that as well.
Well, I think that what we're looking at now is a process, and we're really at the beginning of a process in the aftermath of the elections of the two sides talking to each other, and Tsai Ing-wen has said that she hopes to have more direct discussions with the mainland. And I think also the U.S. has a role to play here, and we know that U.S. official visited Beijing, and Tony Blinken, and of course a representative really of the United States, a former Deputy Secretary Burns went to Taiwan. So I think we'll be encouraging both sides to provide each other with reassurances. I believe that Tsai Ing-wen would be willing to say more, but the question is, what will the mainland give her? And it is only reasonable to expect that if she is willing to say something perhaps similar to Chen Shui-bian's 4 no's and 1 have not that he said in his inaugural address, then what is the mainland going to promise in return? And will they promise not to steal diplomatic allies, keep communications open, et cetera? But I don't think it would be terribly, really unrealistic for President-elect Tsai to say something about how the future of Taiwan is in the hands of the Taiwan people, and I don't rule out any particular outcome. And that includes, it includes independence, but it also includes reunification. But I just don't think she's going to be willing to explicitly state that there is one China. And I think if you look at some of these polling results, tells you that the people of Taiwan are not really eager for a reunification agenda, but they support stable, close cross-strait ties. And actually, still more than 50% have been supporting the 1992 consensus. She has wiggle room, and the last thing that I would say is that she has a mandate. She has won by a very large majority. And how she's going to use that political capital, I think, is very important. And she could use it in some of this regard.
The gentleman sort of in the middle there. Yeah. Sorry? Those are great comments. I wouldn't add anything. Right here, wait.
Yoshi Komori with the Sankei Shimbun of Japan. I have two quick questions. One for Dr. Emerson Niou. We all know that many Taiwanese people have had positive feelings toward Japan traditionally. But your survey that you showed us seemed to indicate that there has been some significant increase of that positive attitude in recent years. And I was wondering what you would attribute that to. Whatever. And then secondly, my question to Dr. Bonnie Glaser. You mentioned the new development between Taiwan and Japan, possibly in the form of the Japanese version of the Taiwan Relations Act. But what would the American reaction be if Japanese current government really starts pushing that idea? No. That's it.
I don't have a good explanation. I'm sorry. I just reported the findings, and actually I haven't even started to look at even the correlations with some demographic variables yet. And so I'm sorry. I don't have a good explanation.
Well, I would just venture some speculation that if you look at where that graph begins to rise, it's really in 2012 when the problems between China and Japan started getting rather serious. And I think there's a lot of support for Prime Minister Abe and the way he is dealing with China. I think people in Taiwan, as they become more concerned about China, they want to see leaders be tough on China. So that's speculation. And now that I forgot the question that you asked me.
There is.
Oh,
What if they pursue
the TRA.
How would the U.S. see?
First, I would say that from what my Japanese friends tell me, that this is highly unlikely to really come to pass in Japan. So I think that's the most important thing. There doesn't seem to be significant support for it in Japan, and I don't think that the Prime Minister has backed it. But that's just what I've heard. As for the U.S. reaction, I think clearly the U.S. and Japan would have very close consultations about a number of key security issues, and I'm sure that we do talk about Taiwan. It would surprise me if the U.S. and Japan had a real gap in our thinking on this issue. I think both of our countries want to see the preservation of peace and stability in the Strait. We also want to see a prosperous and autonomous Taiwan, where the people can make decisions not under coercion from China. And then the question is, what is the best way to do that? And maybe if China is putting a lot of pressure on Taiwan and isolating it, maybe that's a time you start thinking about options like a Taiwan Relations Act in Japan. But in the current environment, it makes no sense to me.
Thank you. Up front here.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. The hotline between Tao and Meg was connected last night for the first time between Zhang Zhijun and Xia Liyan. It was reported, has been reported. And Xia Liyan said the biggest common ground in Taiwan, in the region, is the peaceful and stable development of the cross-strait relations. So my question is, why now? What message they are trying to convey to the region or to both sides? Because this conversation was proposed by Beijing. Yeah. So could you please interpret it? Thank you.
It seems to me that that's consistent with the recent Taiwan Work Conference and other things that have been said in the Taiwan Affairs Office in Beijing, and also consistent, of course, with Xi Jinping's decision to meet with Ma Ying-jeou. That is, it is a signal to the people of Taiwan that the mainland wants to continue to develop the cross-strait relations, but that there is this precondition. But ultimately, the government on the mainland is going to have to turn to the new government in Taiwan. They can continue to talk to the Kuomintang government until the day it leaves office, and so those kinds of messages they will be paid attention to. They have resonance certainly in Taiwan, but the basis on which the KMT and the CCP have had this cooperation is just, it's going to change. It has to. There's been a change of government, and Taiwan is a democracy. And new governments don't come in and just completely inherit the existing set of policies and do nothing new. And I think that's something that Beijing has to become a little bit more comfortable with.
I would just amplify that by touching on a point Bonnie raised earlier, which is that I think it's silly to suggest that on the Chinese side, they have this all worked out already. You know, a lot of these messages seem to me to be signaling we're sorting it out internally, and so whilst we do so, there needs to be stability and calm, you know, and so on. I think it's actually, you see a very similar pattern to what we saw when the U.S. first announced the rebalance. And, you know, while that was going on, at that time, you had serious domestic political situation in China with the downfall of Bo Xilai. You had a succession process right in the middle, and people just weren't willing to stake out turf on that because they needed to do their internal assessments. And as Bonnie pointed out earlier, President Xi's plate is pretty full right now, so I can totally see a situation whereby on this, they want to keep things as steady as they can in the near term. So I think we'll continue to see messages like that, and it's also encouraging that we're seeing them, so this is a good thing. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Zhang Song from Shanghai Wenhui, Delhi. And it seems to me that South China Sea issue will be very sensitive and a tough challenge for Tsai Ing-wen. And she will be facing pressure from the United States and China at the same time. And we see President Ma Ying-jeou landed in Taiping Island a few days back, which U.S. clearly said it's not a kind of constructive kind of action. And will U.S. oppose if Tsai Ing-wen will land in Taiping Island within her tenure? And U.S. might be expecting Tsai Ing-wen to support on different issues in this South China Sea kind of issue, like you may like Tsai Ing-wen to favor this verdict of this kind of attribution kind of tribunal within a few months. But at the same time, it will be very kind of sensitive issue for mainland China. My question is, what do you feel Tsai Ing-wen will behave on this South China Sea issue in her tenure? Thank you.
So first, I think that because of the complexity of this issue, that this is something that's really being studied by the DPP. You know, they're consulting with their lawyers, trying to fully understand the implications of the case. And let's remember that no ruling has been issued. We don't know whether the finding is going to be that Taiping Island is a rock, not an island. There may be no ruling on that at all. And so ultimately, I think that the DPP is going to wait until this ruling comes down before it says anything else. And I think that's ultimately a smart move. But you know, I doubt that the United States is going to be strongly encouraging the DPP one way or another, other than to be careful. I mean, really, even my personal view is really that the U.S. has some conflicting interests here. We really want cross-strait stability to be preserved, but we also would like to have Taiwan as I said, as a good citizen of the international community, respect the ruling of the tribunal, whatever it is. And let's remember that Taiwan is not a member of many treaties in the world, but abides by them. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention. So I understand why Ma was frustrated that Taiwan wasn't invited to be or allowed to be an observer or present materials to the tribunal. But I think that Tsai Ing-wen, she would like to have Taiwan's say in this as well. But I ultimately think they're going to be very careful. And you ask about her whole tenure. I don't think there's any discussion, consideration about whether it's a good idea for her to visit, you know, Taiping Island. The real pressing issue, I think, is this case, because as a new president comes in, they will be compelled to take a position on it. But I think this is not. They recognize that, and I think that President-elect Tsai recognizes that this should not be the issue that determines the future direction of her relationship with the mainland. That would be very risky. So I really think they're going to manage this very carefully.
I think also to the point that's come up earlier, I think where this gets interesting, when I was in Beijing last week, a lot of the discussion, it was interesting, concerns about what Taiwan might do in the South China Sea, and then in the same breath, we're really concerned about Japan looking like it's going to play an increasing role down there. So I think that's where it gets potentially really complicated if we start to see a larger role for the Japanese in that issue, and Taiwan somehow becomes embroiled in all of that. Sir.
Tiger Zhang from CSIS, Freeman Chair. I have a question for Bonnie on the U.S. Taiwan policy. A few years ago here in D.C., the Congress has held a lot of hearings on why Taiwan matters. So my question is, does Taiwan matter more for the United States vis-a-vis the growing contention with China on many strategic fronts? And in other words, is the United States going to use Taiwan more as a democratic or security outpost, as many Chinese have believed? And a related question is, do you think that the U.S. is changing its past policy or past strategy called ambiguous strategy toward the cross-strait relations, as many people have perceived in the U.S. stance to the South China Sea? Thank you.
Well, I guess I would not share your view that the U.S. has an ambiguous stance on the cross-strait situation. I think that clearly the U.S. has some ambiguity on the issue of Taiwan's, the sovereignty issue over Taiwan. But I don't think there's any ambiguity about what kind of relationship the U.S. wants to see across the strait. You have heard administration spokesmen from this administration as well as prior administrations say that they don't want to see unilateral changes in the status quo, that the U.S. doesn't support Taiwan independence. So I think that the stance of the U.S. has been fairly clear. I've always believed that people on the mainland do not understand U.S. policy toward Taiwan. There is this assumption that somehow, as I said, that Taiwan is a card that's used against mainland China. I believe that there is intrinsic value to the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. It begins, of course, with our history with Taiwan. It was formerly, we had a security treaty. We obviously have very close personal ties. It's our 10th largest trading partner. We do an enormous amount with Taiwan. And yes, we do share democratic values. And so I think that that is important as well. I don't know whether I would say Taiwan matters more or matters less. It matters. And if you want to attend another hearing, there will be one on Thursday on the Hill, where I will be testifying, and there will be others, and you can listen. There will be an administration spokesman, also an administration official, who will be giving what I think is likely to be a very important, comprehensive statement on Taiwan. I remember years ago when Jim Kelly gave his statement at a hearing, and that remained the centerpiece, the most important statement of U.S. policy for many years to come. So I guess I just don't accept your premise. Taiwan is important to the U.S. for a large number of reasons, but I just don't think there's that we use it as a card, and I don't think there's any incentive for the U.S. to do that. It wouldn't benefit American interests.
Sir.
Thank you. Wayne Morrison from CRS. You mentioned how Taiwan needs to diversify its trade. You mentioned the TPP. Back in 2010, when President Mao was pushing the ECFA agreement with China, he said one of the major reasons we're doing this is so that China will give us a little breathing room. And you mentioned that they were able to sign a few trade agreements with Singapore and New Zealand. But then later, President Mao complained that nobody wants to negotiate free trade agreements with us because of China. So understanding how important continuation of the ECFA process is to the mainland, and obviously they're going to worry what's going to be the pace of these agreements under the new administration. What can Taiwan do to sort of get Beijing to back off a little bit, to give them a little breathing room to sign these agreements? I mean, in a sense that some are saying that China's strategy is to sort of make Taiwan more dependent on China through these agreements. So the irony for Taiwan is, in order to diversify its trade, it has to become more dependent on Beijing. So I was wondering if you could sort of prescribe what Taiwan can do to get a little breathing room on this issue.
Joshua, you want to start?
You know, I think when thinking about cross-straits economic relations, it's also important to probably, you know, question the extent that the ECFA has actually been the cause of a lot of the growth in the trade. In many respects, if you look at the size of the two economies and their proximity and their other relationships, it was a very underdone relationship for political and other sort of frictions that were there. And in many respects, they were getting removed anyway. And in the process, the ECFA more or less sort of reflected that process rather than sort of catalysed it. You know, and it's unclear. It's unclear how, you know, if you look at, I mean, there's been some gravity models that have been done, and I don't put a lot of, you know, pay a lot of attention to that. But it's worth noting that, you know, the model sort of suggests there's some room for growth, but not necessarily, you know, enormous increases that we've seen in the past. And it's also not clear. I mean, I think the services framework agreement may certainly help the services part of the relationship develop, but it's also, for the reasons I outlined a bit before, not clear, you know, what the capacity is for that to develop significantly. But more to your question, I sort of say this because, you know, I think part of the, I think it's true to say that, and this has been, I think, true of China's other dealings, say, for instance, with Korea, that they tend to emphasise having in place their own trade agreements before they feel comfortable with countries joining other ones. So, for instance, you know, finishing the China-Korea FTA was sort of informally seen as sort of the first step towards, you know, for instance, Korea joining TPP. They haven't joined, but, you know, they've made clear they want to join. It's not clear, you know, and I think certainly, you know, the Taiwan thing adds a whole layer of other complexity, complexity to it. It's, you know, not. I think it is, as I said before, somewhat of a sort of dilemma for both Taiwan and China, because I think that the economic independence thing, as I say, is to some extent a natural outgrowth of just their economies and the way that they've sort of positioned themselves, irrespective of the type of trade agreements they have signed amongst each other. It is, though, I think the case that given the changing landscape of international economic agreements, that the capacity of Taiwan to develop its economic relationships with other countries is now certainly, I think, being harmed, and will continue to be further harmed by its inability to join these agreements. And that's where I think the dilemma lies both for China and Taiwan, because at some level, the growth of that bilateral relationship, whatever its drivers, will create a heightened sense of reliance and will certainly, I think, heighten the Taiwanese sense of the potential for that to be leveraged into other outcomes that they don't want to see happening. And at the same time, though, it's probably going to take a economically sort of confident and better off Taiwan, I think, to actually develop the bilateral relationship in more positive directions, and that's going to require their participation in these other international economic arrangements.
Good, thanks. Well, we're at time, so if you would, please join me in thanking the panel, and thank you for your contributions.